Welcome. Welcome everybody to our AIA Brooklyn's general meeting and our collaboration discussion panel with CityTech. I want to thank the people involved with putting this together, Ting Chin, Paul King, Pierre Theodat, Diana Rodriguez, some of the people from CityTech. There are many more involved. Thank you all for hosting us here. I want to thank our director, David Cunningham, who organizes these meetings and comes up with a subject and finds the people for these wonderful programs. Kelsey Kirkley helps organize and send out the announcements and put the meeting together. Thank you all. I'm calling the meeting to order here at 6:22. Our mission, AIA Brooklyn, is dedicated to the advancement of the architectural profession through education, outreach, and mutual support. I'll have a brief update about membership in general. Next slide, please. It is keep going. We have about 1,113 members, or 33 members. It has a 3 in there somewhere, and it's getting there. So numbers continue to go up. We want to encourage people to join and participate in committees. We have some Cran and Coat updates. There will be a possible passive house tour in towards mid-end of April. Look for the announcements on our website at aiabrooklyn.org. For the Coat Committee, there may be a tour at Grace Farms River. Well, there is a tour at Grace Farms River Building in New Canaan, Connecticut. If you go to the next slide. Yeah. A very interesting place. And April 12th, it's an all-day Friday. It'll take a time to get up there, 11 to 3. Transportation, we will work out carpool, vans, whatever to get us there if you sign up. Space is limited, so if you're interested, please reach out to me at president@aiabrooklyn.org, and we will work on getting a list together and getting people signed up for it. Should be very interesting. Our Emerging Professionals Committee, BCAP, is organizing and getting ready to launch a whole new initiative with co-chairs Ni Zhang, one of our directors, and Ian Azerbeck, who is here. Thank you. Hi, Ian. Lots of things coming up. More to follow. Look at our website. You will see these things posted there. The next thing I want to introduce is our 3 speakers tonight. We have Napur Chaudhuri, Jane Lee, and Meta Brunzima. And I thank you again for coming and attending, and take it from here. Thank you.
Briefly, our topic for the evening is a book that was published a while ago called Bowling Alone. And the author used bowling as a kind of stand-in for community engagement and involvement, and tracked a fairly noticeable decline across the country. It affects voting participation, it affects involvement in public activities, public meetings, it affects volunteering. Also talked about 2 different types of communities. We talked about communities that bonding, which are people that are part of the same group. We talked about bridging, which are people that are, both of those have suffered. We see this, I think we see this in a lot of ways in the way elections are running and how so it's, I think, an important topic, and we left the topic fairly broad, and we have 3 really, really great folks. Al, would you tell me when you need that? Wait, you have notes, so you're the one.
So I work with notes because what happens is that when I start talking, I don't stop. I've been told that I only have 10 minutes, and I also want to give gifts to my co-panelists and make sure that I stay within those 10 minutes and even under 10 minutes. So that's why I've got notes here. Fabulous. This is great. All right. Okay. How many architects does it take to put together a presenter view on a PC? Whew, okay. All right. So, my name is Nuper Chowdhury. I am a planner, public health practitioner, and in a month I will also get my business degree. So, I'm a lifelong learner. I love being in place and space with folks who are not like me because I always get to be in conversation with folks and learn new and different things. And so even though I'm a planner, and I guess adjacent to the architecture profession, I love spending time with architects because you always help me think about things in new and different ways. So I really appreciate the invitation, and I love having conversations with anyone and everyone. So feel free to come up and chat with me afterward. So as it was shared, the theme of this event is talking about community, right? And so as someone who's trained in urban planning and public health, so much of what I do is think about space and place and the health outcomes of what happens in space and place, right? So for me, community is the catalyst for better health. And community building and building community is what happens in place. So in my work, I often think about the how, right? So how people connect with one another to create community. I look at the way folks connect with one another and the strength of those connections. So David was talking a little bit about that bridging and bonding. So I think a lot about that and think about how we can strengthen those. And partly it's because so much of that is the fact that these connections and the strength of those connections improve the health of people, of communities, and the nation, right? So the US Surgeon General came out with a report last year focusing on the idea and this idea of connection and cohesion. So for our time together, I'll spend a little bit of time framing the situation we are in this country spatially. I'll introduce the Surgeon General's report, and then I'll propose a way forward through the organization that I run called AIA, which stands for In Our Backyard. So what's the situation that we're in? I learned and had the privilege of being taught by Mindy Foley-Love, who is a board certified psychiatrist and looks at the health effects of displacement. And when she was up at Columbia, I was lucky enough to study under her. And she and Broderick Wallace came up with this idea and coined this phrase of serial forced displacement, right? So what is that? We find ourselves in this state which is defined as the repetitive, coercive upheaval of people and groups. So the repetitive, coercive upheaval of people and groups. So how do we see this play out? In the US, I've taken just a small snapshot here to show the multiple pieces of this puzzle, right? Policies that build on each other to foster serial forced displacement. So whether it's Jim Crow policies, whether it's redlining, urban renewal, right? Urban renewal was a very loud policy, a very quiet policy around basically disinvestment and kind of strategic disinvestment is another one, planned shrinkage. These are all different pieces of the puzzle that we're able to tear people from place to place, right? To tear people from communities and tear communities from place. So if you wanted to, you could look at more modern approaches like rezonings or a mayor's housing plan as a policy that contributes to the larger dynamic of serial forced displacement. And so when you start thinking about these policies, the ones that I shared were US-based policies, but these are definitely global approaches, right? So if you wanted to look at it globally, you'd be looking at settler colonialism, you'd be looking at the multiple situations of both partition and forced state making. These are all pieces of serial forced displacement. And this idea of serial forced displacement is the cause of and powers this national concern here in the US around social disconnection. So being forcefully displaced creates a rupture in your way of being, right? You lose connections, you lose your bearings. Think about what happens when you're on a new computer and you lose all your bookmarks. You're totally unmoored. You don't know where to go, right? You've lost your anchors. This is what happens with displacement. You lose your anchors, you lose your people, you lose your connections. And so I want to share this graph here because these are trends over the past 7 years before COVID, right? And it looks at how time spent alone increased. So we can see that isolation increased in this country. And this was before COVID, right? So the graph was published in the US Surgeon General's report that came out last year, one that looked at the health effects of disconnection and isolation. And in this report, he has some key findings, right? He looks at the mortality impact of disconnection and social isolation. He talks about the mortality impact of being lonely as the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The effects are greater if the individual experiences obesity and or experiences physical inactivity. Loneliness and social isolation increase the risk for premature death by 26% and 29% respectively. And within the report, Dr. Murthy, our US Surgeon General, states that a 2022 study found that when people were asked how close they felt to others emotionally, only 39% of the adults in the US said that they felt very connected to others. Less than half of the folks in this country. Every level of increase in social connection corresponds with a risk reduction across many, many health conditions. So put another way, every point of connection improves your health by a certain amount. So in the report, Dr. Murthy goes on and he highlights key inputs, right? I've listed many of them here. You can definitely read the report. And he talks about these key inputs that create this outcome of social isolation in this country, right? He calls it the greatest epidemic of our generation. And he is someone who has just experienced COVID. And he says that this is the greatest epidemic of our generation. But so for the purposes of the folks in the room, architects, he highlights an important term that we should focus on. Social infrastructure, the physical elements of a community. Dr. Murthy describes this term as the physical elements that support the development of social connection. So the presence or absence of social infrastructure influences the level of connection or isolation in a community. And he shares all the factors that shape social connection, right? So you can read the report. It's to the public at large, so it's very readable. You don't have to be a public health practitioner or a doctor. He's not super specific around some of the pieces. He's just giving the lay of the land, but it's like a very good appetizer around some of this work. But again, we see the role that architects and designers have in shaping the health of our nation here. And so when we think about our role, and if we see the illness or diagnosis as serial forced displacement, and we understand our contributions as folks in the field, what could we name as the antidote? For me, it's a concept that was moved forward by Catherine Brown and Bill Moorish. I think some of you know Bill Moorish. So it's this idea of planning to stay as an opposition to serial forced displacement. When we think about our work, we need to think about and work with groups and people that are planning to stay and want to stay. And we need to ask two questions. What brought you here? And what would it take for you to be able to stay? These two questions open up a multitude of possibilities in the work. And it's the folks that can answer this question that I and my team work closely with through my organization, AIA, which stands for In Our Backyards. So we're a nonprofit online platform for civic leaders to raise money and resources nationwide. IOB stands for In Our Backyards. It's a positive opposite of NIMBY. IOB's model is based on crowdfunding as a tool for civic strength and movement building. We work with people that can answer that second question. What would it take for you to stay? And we work with people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and make that happen. So we work on resources, developing connections. We work to increase capacity, right? So much of our important work is offline, even though we do have a tech tool where folks are able to crowdfund, right? We provide one-on-one coaching, match programs. So we will do some work of fundraising in advance of, so that for folks in the room who may think about using IOB as a platform and get their friends together to crowdfund. Every dollar that's raised becomes $2. Every $10 becomes $20. Every $100 becomes $200. For folks who decide not to go the 501c3 route, right, which is the oppression of the US tax IRS restrictions, we'll fiscally sponsor you, right? So for us, we just want you to do the work, right? It's okay, we can handle the other pieces. And so fiscal sponsorship has been something that we've been supporting and have been doing for a while now. But overall, in all of our work, we grounded in equity, right? This idea that the people who are in place and space understand what needs to happen to stay in that place and space. And we work to remove those barriers to make sure that it can happen. I'll say that it's important to note, right, that neighbors helping neighbors has been around for generations, right? So when you look at Black Panthers Free Breakfast Program, it was local leaders seeing a need and pooling their resources and gathering their resources to create that change, right? This really isn't any different than that. IOB was founded 15 years ago in Brooklyn, actually. It later expanded nationally. But we as an organization believe that crowdfunding is a powerful tool for positive change, and that there's a need for support for grassroots groups or deep roots and individuals, right, that may lack access to that traditional philanthropy structure and bridge. We work to meet that need, and we center that community vision and that idea of self-determination in our work. So the criteria for the folks that we work with is pretty simple, right? So you know, it has to take place in where you live, right? So you have to be in that place and space to be able to lead that project, and the project has to have a public benefit. Anyone can work with us, right? So you can be an individual, you can be an organization. You know, some of them are 501c3, some of them are not. In our last survey and our last analysis of folks that we've supported, over, I think it's now 52% are BIPOC identifying. It might actually be more. But like I said before, the services that we provide are deep root services, right? It's folks who are small, unincorporated, often volunteer-led groups without access or connections to traditional philanthropy. Right, so annual budget is usually less than 25,000, usually less than 2 million, right? And we work with larger organizations, but that's not our focus. So I just want to share this slide because you all are architects and you all really like well-designed slides. I have to say, this is not my slide. So this is my buddy Brian Lee, who's based in New Orleans, who founded the nonprofit design firm Co-Locate. He and I collaborate through Dark Matter U, Design as Protest, and he talks a lot about this idea of design justice and deconstructing complex injustice, right? And he uses this slide to walk through how you can work to deconstruct complex injustice in place. And so, you know, when I think about this around the work that IOB does, when I think about this work as related to community, this is where IOB is, right? We have people who see an existing condition in a space and place. They know that there needs to be a change, and they're the folks that are best suited to make that happen, and we help them make that happen to a new condition, a new reality, a more connected community. So for all the architects and designers in the room, I want to bring it back to these two key questions. And think about who you need to be in conversation with as you design and build. Who do you get to learn from in the places and spaces that you want to work in or are working in? And how are you in concert with, rather than clashing with, what's already happening on the ground, in the grassroots, and in the deep roots? And how are you centering that work in your designs and your deliverables? We'd love to help you, so feel free to talk to me afterwards.
thank you again for inviting me here. My name is Meta Brunsma. I'm an architect and urban designer at the Collective for Community, Culture, and Environment. So we are a all women-owned collective, which is a non-hierarchical organization. We have 19 members and 10 affiliates. And you can look us up on our website. Last one. I have to help you for a second. Yeah, okay, now we're getting there. So one last thing to say about double click. While he figures this out, one last thing about the collective. As our name implies, we work with a mission, and the mission is to support community, culture, and environment. So we are primarily focused on working on socially, environmentally, and culturally supportive projects. And we refuse to do projects that are not in that line of work, which has been very refreshing, and you can check us out on our website. Today, I will be speaking about 2 projects that may surprise you, that are somewhat unusual for an architecture firm. And I know
Does anyone know the shortcut just for
Control. That's fine. Don't worry. I can also speak without slides. Okay.
Oh, there, it's back. Arrow, oh, go back. Go.
I see the arrow. I see it. I got it.
All right.
Okay.
It's cool. I'm gonna have a lemon bar and just call it a night.
So Newport could not have made better presentation that better introduces what I'm about to talk about. I happen to be an architect and urban designer, so I'm actually, involved day to day on many of the topics that she introduced. And the idea of displacement and permanent displacement will become evident in the first project that I'll be presenting, my work on supporting NIDIS, which is the New York Disaster Interface Services group, on creating asylum seeker shelters in New York City right now. This project is not complete. It's happening. It is shifting. And you will be surprised to see what kind of work that is. It's been a roller coaster of a project. The second project I'll be talking about is a community land trust. The collective has worked with multiple community land trusts. This one is in Queens. This is the Ravenswood Community Land Trust. And again, it has a fairly extraordinary story that is a very hopeful and exciting story. So let's start with the asylum seeker shelters. So let's just, as you probably know, there are about 175,000 asylum seekers have come to New York City so far. However, only 70,000 are currently housed by the city of New York, which means that a lot of them actually have left and have been, relocated to towns in upstate New York, which is actually part of the asylum seeker program that the city is pursuing. Most of them come from South America and West Africa, of course, of other nations as well. But that is generally the situation that we're in. And the collective, I'm one of the architects in the collective, have started to work with the Interfaith Disaster Services, which works with faith communities in New York City on one of the mayor's programs to house asylum seekers in faith, houses of faith, not only Christian, but Jewish, Muslim mosques, etc. So it has been very interesting. So let's see, can you go to the next slide, please? So you all are probably aware of images like this. This is the Port Authority bus terminal. Here are the asylum seekers coming off the bus. Next slide, please. You see the signs. The city is welcoming them. Next slide, please. You can also see very negative slides. Most likely when I Googled, migrants or asylum seekers in New York City, you see horrible images like this. It seemed to pervade the media. So it's actually quite shocking, even though these represent reality as well. Next slide, please. And then we've all heard about the tents, right? This happens to be the one on Rikers Island. And having talked to colleagues and even people inside my firm, there's a lot of mystery about what is happening, right? And the city has not been terribly forthcoming, even to people that are working fairly directly with the city, such as myself. Next slide, please. And to sort of clear up some of the myth, our controller, Brad Lander, has actually put out a report that you should all Google before you talk to other people about the migrant crisis. And I just wanted to highlight a few facts here before we go into what the work is like and what exactly an architect can do to contribute. So, the immigrants actually benefit our economy, and they drive workforce growth. There, in fact, is asylum seeking is a legal way of immigrating into the country. And apparently, this particular crisis is not even unprecedented. So there have been similarly large surges of immigrants, etc. I just wanted to bring this up here because I don't have the time to go through all of these in detail, but there needs to be background facts when talking to asylum seekers because things get very emotional for many people. Next slide, please. So this was essentially the start of where my project started. The mayor got together with the faith community and awarded a $70 million contract to the New York Disaster Interface Services Network to create asylum shelters in houses of faith. And the beginning was very, very rocky. Next slide, please. So originally the idea was that you would have either 19 or 38 asylum seekers, usually separated by gender. In other words, only men or only women, and then or families, which is not something that I'm dealing with because families are primarily dealt with in larger spaces. So the task, the architectural task, the task of the Department of Buildings and the Department of the Fire Department is to technically convert, since you're all architects, you understand this, the use group from a public assembly use to a residential use. So what we're technically doing is doing a temporary use change to a residential use group. Okay, and the city is very interested in actually doing that, while at the same time making sure that the spaces that we're looking at, meaning existing houses of faith, while changing the use to make them temporary, and by temporary the city means 2 years, a 2-year stay of a cohort of 15 asylum seekers in a religious space. While they're doing that, the city decided to get a cool benefit, which is to actually upgrade all of these houses. I will be showing you some images of some of the houses of faith that I have visited, and it has been amazing. I have been in places in New York City where I have never dreamt of going, like in the far reaches of the Bronx and Queens. I mean, all over the city, and it's been very, very interesting. Also from an understanding of society and who welcomes whom and so forth. One thing that I have noticed is that a lot of the faith communities that have been welcoming toward asylum seekers also run other social programs, such as food programs. Many of them feed many homeless people and have, the food vans next to their church or synagogue. So it's been very interesting also to meet very, very generous people throughout this work. Now, putting beds into a large room is not exactly requiring even a master's degree. But navigating all of the sort of politics and working with the city through a third party, which is the NIDIS, has been quite interesting. The city has dropped the idea of housing larger groups of asylum seekers, in part because they were not able to find enough sprinkler houses of faith. And they have changed the program to become smaller, i.e. only housing 15 asylum seekers at a time, which does not require a sprinkler system. Okay, interesting, right? So let's look at the cost. And a lot of people have talked about cost, and that seems to be a primary topic of discussion. So you can see, you can actually, download this if you go on their website. This is all public information. This is what they send to the houses of faith. And so a house of faith can get $570,000 per year to house 15. But it's a little bit small on here. But what you have to understand is that there's a whole security system. There's like 2 certified fire guards, there's security people. There is laundry services. There is welcoming services. There are, you have to make sure that, they they have a place to go during the day. There are social services in some instances attached to this. The amount of files and folders that the city, the Department of Buildings, the fire department have to put together on all of these, and the paper trail that is required to actually make one of these sites happen is insane. It really is. And so what this has led me to understand and put into perspective what this cost is all about. Now, and some people say, well, we could be doing this cheaper, it should be more permanent. There's some great ideas which we can discuss. There are many other fantastic ideas out there that we can discuss during the Q&A. But let's keep going, just showing you a little bit the process here. This is a crazy flow chart. And NIDIS, as I said, is the Disaster Interface Services. They sort of screen the House of Faith. Then we have the Department of Buildings and the Fire Department go and inspect. And then there is a code compliance. There's actually a fire specialist who's also a professor, who's literally going out there and trying to remedy all the violations, including boiler and whatever violation they may have. Once all of that is done, I come in and I go and visit incredible places all over. And not only do I look at the site, see if all of the things have been remedied correctly, if I see other things that are wrong with the site and so forth, then I figure out some kind of a layout. I have to draw the space. There's not much design to this thing, but there is to some extent, because you create dining and sleeping facilities for people. So that is creating some kind of community. And all of this needs to be signed and sealed, and there's lots of forms associated with it. And then there's an attorney, and the Department of Buildings and Fire Department then reviews everything that I hand in. And that is then filed with the borough commissioner of the respective borough. Okay, so every single one of these little 15-person sites has a massive filing process associated with it. Next slide, please. Here we have some of the sites. This one is the Bronx. So this is what it looked like before it became a shelter, just like their community room. Okay, next slide, please. Here is a synagogue that was turned into a daycare center, and you can sort of see the light blue paint and the remnant of some religious. And it decided to house asylum seekers. This is in Queens. There was a very negative article written about it from people complaining about it in the neighborhood, which was very hard to see for me. Next slide, please. This one is Ridgewood Presbyterian, also in Queens. Again, you can sort of see like community halls and things like that are the kinds of sites that I would be working with. Next slide, please. That is actually the plan for that very same, you can see I sign and seal. Next slide, please. So many questions need to be resolved. This program is by far from perfect because while we are trying to help this place that Nupur just talked about, right, and try to welcome them in the best possible way. And I must give the mayor credit for not having them sleep on the street, right? Because, you know, many people come off the bus, where would they sleep if they didn't have these programs? The city response is inadequate. We'll discuss this in the Q&A maybe. The path to citizenship is difficult because there's many months during which they cannot work. And the paperwork is complex. Some of the asylum seekers have crazy, you know, dialects, right? That need translators and so forth. So there are many nonprofits that are helping with this, but funding is short. And as Brad Lander said, we need more money from the government. There are interesting new ideas about employment. I recently was part of a panel that talked about worker cooperatives. You do not need to be, don't need to have a visa in order to actually be an entrepreneur and be a co-owner of a worker cooperative. So there's many other creative ideas that I can talk about, but I have a very, very short time, and I want to talk about the next project. And I'm certain that I'm over time, but let's continue discussing this during the Q&A. Let's go to the Ravenswood Queens Community Land Trust. Very quickly, Community Land Trust is when community members decide to collectively own a piece of land or multiple pieces of land, which they then legally separate from what is above the land, which can then be leased or rented or even sold, with the intent of keeping rents or payments affordable in perpetuity. And there's if you Google Community Land Trust, there's a tripartite governance to ensure that there is permanent affordability. The collective has worked on the Edgemere Community Land Trust as well, so we have a little bit of familiarity with this. Next slide, please. So what the collective got invited to talk about a potential community land trust at the Ravenswood houses in Western Queens. What you see a little bit to the left is Roosevelt Island, Long Island City. Go to the next slide, please. You can see the East River, the corner there. And the Ravenswood houses were built in 1951, the NYCHA project. And the circle denotes sanitation garage, which is basically garbage trucks, right? Right in the middle of the public housing project. So that is really what I knew when we were asked to do 2 community workshops together with Queens College and the Ravenswood Tenants Association to talk to the Ravenswood neighbors about what would happen if this garage would be relocated. Because, next slide, please. In 2017, the mayor decided to relocate it. And look at this garage. I mean, look at the trucks that are right next to the playground. It is pretty unbelievable. And, you know, and what we heard from the residents was that it was literally like toxic smell, everything, day in, day out. And this garage was built in 1931, so it's been actually at the site even longer than the housing project itself. So that is what I came into, and as inquisitive as I am, I decided to do a little bit of research in advance of the community engagement workshop, and decided to look into the history of the site, which was an unbelievable experience. Next slide, please. So this is actually this is sort of the setting up the community workshop. That was the flyer and so forth. But let's go to the next slide. So here is a little bit of what I found. So let's actually go to the top right because that is essentially what we're talking about. Turns out there's a massive creek that is buried underneath of this site. This is called the Sunswick Creek, and you can see it on the 1852 map at the top right. And this is its current condition underneath of the site. There are many other historic maps. I wasn't able to fit them all, but I remember the night, it was probably 11 o'clock at night when I found the creek, and I kind of compared it to the street map, and my jaw was dropping open. I'm going like, no, this is not possible. This is not possible. Then I traced it and I traced it, and you can see it right here. You see the sanitation garage right here? It is like right under. So next time I went to the site, I noticed that, that in the park, there's this little, game court, and all the pavement was cracking, and I'm like going like, cha-ching. Now I know why. High groundwater, the creek is right under there. Turns out, many, many hours of reading and going through historic documents showed that first the creek was really beautiful and had fish and everything, and then it was dammed for a variety of reasons because of industrialization started to creep in and so forth. And as the neighborhood sort of urbanized, it became more and more polluted. At that point, malaria broke out. Then people tried to fill it with, sort of construction debris from the construction of the bridges and all of that. So basically, all sorts of stuff got dumped into there. And it's really what we call, environmental, almost racism, because it was literally like, hidden and buried away. And to no surprise, this is the 1938 redlining map. Redlining was also on Newport's slide. It's one of the ways in which, people are discriminated against. And as you can see, red all around our site. And the site itself was, in fact, not even considered a site because there's no color. Next slide, please. Then we looked at the photographs from the municipal archives, and it got worse. It got even worse. So it's a little fuzzy, the photograph of 1924, and you can sort of see that black line there. That is the line of the park that is right next to the garage. The garage is here. This is where the huge incinerator used to be in 1924. There you can see it. This is a massive incinerator, okay, with miles of ashes. I have other photos of that. And this is where the garage. Now, what you can see here, to no surprise, is some water creeping up, which is the rest of the creek, So it was semi-agricultural and an ash dump for many years. Next slide, please. Then it got even worse. Look at this. You can see on the slide there, that is the garage already built. This is 1942. There's the sanitation garage. And look at this ridiculous pile of scrap metal. So that was a scrap metal yard, most likely for World War II, right? Right there exactly where the park is, right? So, and to follow that, and you can then see this is the same garage right here, and the brand new Ravenswood houses without a single tree at the time, of course. So many of the public housing projects were built on the cheapest land. That's why so many of them are in flood zones and in areas that have been previously polluted. So just, I recommend to anyone to always do a historic map analysis and some literature review, because it can be incredibly revealing. So what that meant is that we were able to actually communicate that to the residents at our workshops. Our workshops were held during COVID. Next slide, please. As you can see, we couldn't even meet inside. This was 2020. So here we are trying to do a professional community workshop outside, and we succeeded. Now, what was even more successful was the process. Keep going. It was very low tech. As you can see, we didn't have screens. We decided to go with stickies, and people were very, very engaged. Next slide, please. We did a SWOT analysis. Planners know what that is. Strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, and had a lot of response. Yeah, it was very, very fun and engaged. Next slide, please. And here we have a very important person that we're going to continue talking about today, which is Deja Daniels. She learned at the very first workshop about this opportunity, and there were about like 3 weeks between the first and the second workshop. She and her friends got to work and decided that she would actually do a survey of Ravenswood residents, going door to door, between the first and the second workshop, and find out what the community really wanted on the sanitation site. And this is a list of, this very professional looking survey that she did with her friends, Deja, Mike Jones, and Shamika, all of whom are co-founders of the Now Community Land Trust. And what they were really interested in primarily were job creation programs and sports and recreation programs. So we have job creation, education, vocational innovation, sports and recreation, particularly basketball, media, podcasting, radio, and so forth, and auditorium. So what they wanted is like a really fabulous community center for their community land trust, with local businesses being part of that. Next slide, please. So the good news is that that Deja, who's on the second person on the slide, and Shamika and Mike, who did this survey, got together with Lorenzo, who happens to be here tonight. Say hi, Lorenzo. And actually formed a nonprofit, the Ravenswood Community Land Trust, and they got their 401c3 typo, last December. So I have continued to work with them together with some of my students at Pratt Institute, and we're now helping them to really ramp up their efforts to raise funds. So what they would like is, obviously control of the land. Their idea is to take the 62,000 square foot site that will be vacated once the sanitation garage gets demolished, and get it for $1. Be able to develop something that they will, develop with their community partners. And the sort of like tentative title for the project is called Community Power Center, the Ravenswood Community Power Center, which would then encompass all of these different programs. So next slide, please. So I worked with some of my students on ideas for this, so you can sort of see what it could be. It could be an amazing sports facility, job training, could be health training, it could be construction training, it could have rentable spaces, could be many, many different things. These are not ideas that will be implemented, but these are ideas that will be used to workshop in the coming months when Lorenzo and his team go and do major community engagement in the Ravenswood houses. The idea here primarily is to create something that is self-sustaining financially, right? So there were even crazy ideas like having, cannabis farm, or tournament basketball, so that you can actually have revenues in the long run. So this project is just beginning. I hope that you will give it some support and follow it in the news, and continue to listen. And I actually have very great hope that this will be a project that will, quote, create.
phone of you will understand what I'm saying. Yeah. I was thinking about this today because when I was in college, I originally went to go study political science and sociology, and I had a French, like a French conversation class we could take. And I remember talking to my French conversation teacher and saying, I think I want to study architecture. And she was like, you can't study architecture. You like people too much. And it really struck me as an odd response. But I think that is kind of like it was a little while ago, I was in college, just to be clear. I think it was like, it was like this idea of this like fountainhead architect who comes from on high and tells you, what your design should be. And I was thinking about that the other day because I think the way that I structure my practice and community work and other projects has always been rooted in people, like not me necessarily, but other people. So this presentation is kind of divided into 3 sections. One is talking about community as a practice, community outside of the practice, like other projects we do, and then a project that we were working on to kind of redefine community. So, but I talk kind of fast, so I think we'll be done pretty soon. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. This is just a description of our firm, but when people ask me what kind of architecture we do, I usually say anything that interests us, and that's usually either a client we really want to work on, a project typology we really want to work on, or sometimes it's just a project that seems kind of hard, or like something we've never done before. And we actually usually talk about it in the office. Like I'll be like, is anybody interested in this project? And if somebody really is, then we consider bringing it in. I'm also a founder of a nonprofit called Design Advocates, which I'll talk about a little later. Okay, next slide. So our practice. This is us. Actually, go to the next slide. We've added a couple of people. Zach photoshopped that in this morning. I'm really proud of that. Okay. Next slide. And we do all kinds of work from next slide. You can kind of just scroll through these, like residential work, and then we do educational work, and we've done we're working on a big nonprofit master plan in Pennsylvania, and like smaller buildings, sort of additions to residential applications. And I think the thing that is important about all of that work that we do, it's really about building relationships and connections. We tend to be and actually become friends with a lot of our clients, but our whole process is kind of figuring out what they want and how we can solve it. We're sort of, problem solvers, but not with like a specific design intent coming in. And I think that is sort of a fun part of our practice. We're kind of constantly reinventing it for each project. In 2020, I founded with a group of other people Design Advocates. The pandemic had hit, everything had stopped. Like everybody's projects stopped. We were like really worried about the city as a whole, as I'm sure everybody was. Like, friends of ours who ran small businesses, who had restaurants, kids in school, like we just had no idea how things were going to move forward. So a group of 5 of us got together and started saying, okay, well, what can we do? We're not in the office, nobody knows what's going on. So we started putting out feelers to people and just being like, does anybody need help with anything design related at all? We started helping restaurants figure out how to get open dining. We started figuring out for public schools how they could start thinking about opening back up, like coming up with reopening plans. And we also started helping other architects and designers figure out how the heck to get through this. I mean, architects in general, I think historically kind of keep all their information close to the vest. And it became this kind of amazing moment where you're like, look, I got a loan. Here's how I did it. Here's the guy I talked to. This is the paperwork you need. This is what you have to prove. I'm going to call him and give him your name. Because it was as much about helping the city stay afloat as it was about helping our community stay afloat. And that community is architects, outside of architects, the people you pass every day. So this is a few projects that we worked on. Next slide, sorry. The first, these are kind of out of order, but this is a gallery for neurodiverse artists, and it's a really small space. It's in Williamsburg. It's called Summertime. It's really amazing, and the women who run it are incredible. But they had a very small space and wanted to figure out, this actually happened after the pandemic, but wanted to figure out how they could have a space both where they could give artists residencies and have gallery space to show their work. So we helped them sort of figure out a flexible design plan complete with furniture. Next slide. And so we did a big community workshop asking the artists and the gallerists what they want, what kind of space they want, what kind of display they need, and then ended up fabricating or helping them fabricate, furniture, chairs, and the rest of their space. Next slide. This was the reopening of a public school. This is the oldest operating public school in Greenpoint. It's a railroad style school. So when the schools reopened, the idea of keeping kids separate was like, no, like they just could not get their heads around it. They were like, I don't know what to do. So we were like, okay, we're going to figure this out. We're going to color code everything. There's going to be different entrances for every classroom. Fourth grade's going to go up first. Fifth grade's going to go up next. These classrooms use these bathrooms. And we really sat with the administration for a long time figuring out how to make this work. And so first we assigned all the classrooms colors. Next slide. By the way, this is not up to like current code at all, so but it was built ages ago. And then we helped them figure out all of the different entrances that could go in, who arrived at different times, like at 8:30, somebody came at 8:40. Third floor went up first, then the second floor went up first floor. Next slide. And like helped them figure out all the spacing in the classrooms. And the thing that was amazing about this work was, it made some graphics, but it made the teachers who had been petrified to go back to school suddenly feel really comfortable about going back to school. They're like, oh wait, hey, we have a plan, which up until that point, nobody really had. And it helped kids get back in the classroom, it helped teachers feel safe, and it helped that whole community kind of like have a handle on what was going to happen going forward. And the parents who were also scared. Okay, next slide. We also helped with a open restaurants toolkit, because those, the guidelines for the open restaurants, I'm sure you all have heard enough about open restaurants, but we'll go over it really quickly. They kind of had, like, most restaurant owners kind of had no idea what that meant, right? Like, you'd read the written description of what you needed to do and be like, how many pounds of force? I don't know what you're talking about. So we made a graphic toolkit for restaurants. We worked with structural engineers, we worked with mechanical engineers to provide heated enclosures, and we sort of made a visual guide. Next slide. And we also provided specifications for those slides, like use this tape, use this piece of equipment, use this connector, so people could just go to Home Depot, get the thing they needed, and build themselves an outdoor dining area. Next slide. And we talked about in the winter how you make it so it stays up safe and like snow doesn't fall on people. Next slide. And we also helped a couple of restaurants. This is Koputiam, which was in the Lower East Side, figure out their outdoor dining with sort of design branding aesthetics. This one was interesting because these are like 5 different options. There's a bookstore here, and the bookstore was afraid that people wouldn't know where they were if there was an outdoor dining thing. So we worked with both groups to figure out outdoor dining options. We also helped the restaurant figure out where they could do takeout and delivery, and how people could do that safely and minimize contact. Next slide. And then this is a project we did with Neighborhoods Now, helping the Bed-Stuy bid come up with outdoor vendors so that all the shops could move their wares outside. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then this is my portion. I told you I was going to go really fast, right? This is the portion about sort of redefining community. And this is a project that we did. Next slide. But okay, I did it out of order. Okay, so the All Along project is a project that we did that is a proposal to honor and celebrate contributions of local women. Next slide. And this was done in collaboration with Jane Bull, who's the executive director of the National Congress of Neighborhood Women. Next slide. And they're like a really awesome organization that's been, for 40 years, has been working on sort of women's issues in North Brooklyn, but they're also heavily involved in the UN. They they've helped organize a lot in NYCHA. They've helped immigrant women find, jobs and education and places to live. So they're a pretty amazing group who was really active 40 years ago, probably about 10 years ago, started losing membership, and now is like rebuilding in a really amazing way. It's also UN week. They've been there all week. Okay, next slide. And this is kind of some of the work they do. Actually, Meta's group worked on this, talk about synergy. This is Jane, who worked with us a lot on this project. Okay, next slide. So this whole project started with a conversation that Jane and I had one day, where she was talking about how, every community group you go to, or every advocacy group, is like often heavily led by women. Women are like instrumental in building community. They're often the ones who are advocating for better housing in NYCHA. They're the ones who are in PTA meetings. They're the ones who are community board meetings. They're the ones who are fighting environmental injustice. I mean, not exclusively, but they're heavily represented. And that representation is not part of kind of the public civic infrastructure. Like, you take the George Washington Bridge, you go down the Henry Hudson Parkway, you go past the Javits Center, you go, back up the FDR, over the Ed Koch Bridge. There's not a lot of representation of women in this narrative right here. You could end up at the Kosciuszko Bridge, also a guy. So, next slide. So that conversation, Jane had sort of been talking about, she would love to have a park that honored women, but it made us start thinking, like, is that enough? Is that really the way we want women to be represented? So we started doing research. Also, shout out to Zachary Jackson here, who made almost all of the images in this part of the presentation. So I just wanted that representation. We gotta give him a shout out. I don't want to take credit for all of this, but we started doing some research, and of the monuments in New York City, the number honoring women is 1.9%, right? And next slide. And so then, nationally, the percentage of statues honoring women is 6.23%. But if you take out any fictional characters like Lady Liberty, Lady Victory, anything like that, you go down to 0.3% of all national monuments honor women. Also, like Alice in Wonderland is very heavily represented. I'm not sure why. There's a couple other ones that you're like, why do we have so many statues of this? Okay, next slide. And in New York, only 5% of the parks are named after women. We are beaten out by any kind of religious, historical, and location honoring. We do beat flora and fauna, which I find to be at least somewhat comforting, but still not a great representation. And that's of the 1,700 parks in New York City. Okay, next slide. So we started talking about, Jane's original plan had been, like, we should make a park. But we started thinking, is that really the right way to do this? Like, one park, one location. It doesn't feel quite satisfying enough, and it also feels kind of divorced from the rest of the city. And so we started, there are great institutions and great organizations that have started correcting the statue count. Like, this is one of them. This is in Central Park. Next slide. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is getting a statue. Next slide. Shirley Chisholm, a big monumental, I don't actually know if this is still happening, but this was going to be at Prospect Park. Next slide. There's even parks, again, Shirley Chisholm, named after women. But again, those are few and far between, and it's one woman. And it also always represents one woman who's been sort of elevated and recognized and has had a certain amount of success. When you think about what actually builds a community, it's often kind of like boots on the ground, like women who are showing up every day and, like, fighting a power plant, or showing up every day and advocating for something. So we sort of tried to think about how we could change that narrative. Next slide. So we started looking at other green spaces that weren't just Central Park, Prospect Park, McCarran Park, Fort Greene Park, and we started identifying green streets. And there are green streets and privately owned public spaces. And there's like about 2,500 green streets in New York City. Next slide. And there's 592 privately owned public spaces. So we started thinking, well, okay, if we put like a monument in each of those, we get that representation up to about 47% versus 5%. So we're doing a little better, right? Like we're changing that number. But then we start like, so, okay, sorry, next slide. But then we started thinking, okay, is it one statue per park or how do we want to do it? Next slide. And then we started thinking, okay, we don't want to take any statues away. We don't want to kind of fight the long fight of like, oh, we're going to remove this statue and do this. So instead we kind of came up with like a slightly more guerrilla move, I guess, which is just starting to embed plaques that honor women in these different locations. Next slide. And we started coming up with a toolkit of ways that those could be deployed. Next slide. So they could be signs, pavers. Oh, that's a sign again. Next slide. Next slide. Or they could be plaques that attach to handrails in different locations. And our idea is that we would come up with prototypes of those three different things using, Parks Department guidelines, DOT guidelines, and start sort of deploying those throughout the city. Next slide. We would also like to link all of those with a QR code using really simple technology. Like QR codes, pandemic brought that one back, right? So QR codes and like Instagram or something where you could go up to a plaque, read the name, scan it, and then get a full biography of that person. And you could also see who else they were connected to, and that could end up becoming sort of a walking tour, also a history of that neighborhood. Next slide. So you would be able to see other markers nearby and see, like what organizations they were connected to, what other markers they were connected to, and really start understanding a history of a place, not just a history of one woman, but a history of the whole neighborhood. Which I think in New York especially, which is like constantly kind of turning over, is like a really nice sort of written memory, like a written register of who made that neighborhood what it was. Next slide. These are pavers. Next slide. And so that's where we left it. What we're currently working on, we've been meeting with the Parks Department. We're working on getting fundraisers and grantors. We're currently working on a permit for a temporary public art submission to sort of have a proof of concept. We're working on some prototypes, and we're sort of starting to partner with certain community groups and community boards, which is National Congress of Neighborhood Women has been instrumental in kind of pulling all of that together. And while this model is like currently for honoring women, the idea is that that toolkit would be kind of open source. So anybody could use that toolkit to use it to honor whoever they want to honor. It would be kind of a citywide, it could be nationwide, obviously, but it would be used by you would have all the kind of requirements to fill the DOT guidelines, so you could be, or the Department of Parks guidelines, so you could be sort of installed anywhere throughout the city. So it would be kind of a community-based organizing, honoring system. That's it. Oh, sorry. Dang it. Thought it was done.
Questions?
Awesome.
Thank you very much for your presentations. They're very inspiring. I have two questions. There's currently a major crisis in New York of the loss of one of its most important historic building typologies, which are the churches. They seem to be under siege by real estate developers that want to use the fact that these communities are challenged by a loss of community to take the buildings, demolish them, alleging that they have building deficiencies. And as you were making your presentation, it occurred to me it would be a natural alliance to connect your work with migrants with these empty church structures as asylums. Use the money that's provided to renovate those places to deal with whatever insufficiencies those buildings have, and save a very important public resource, the prime architectural markers of Brooklyn, one time known as the city of churches.
So this is actually one of the goals of the program, to co-benefit houses of faith that are financially struggling. So it is in fact already meeting that the goal that you're addressing. I happen to also be part of a group called the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, which is looking to help houses of faith that are that have been approached by a developer that wants to, demolish their building or give them, $500,000 for their site or whatever, and destroy the houses of faith, be it Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. But this is happening a lot, and the developers often deal with communities that have no development experience, and sometimes get ripped off. And as you were saying, there's a great loss of houses of faith. It turns out that houses of faith actually provide a huge amount of social services that are often, free. In most cases, in fact, free. And so, I am also part of another group called Bricks and Mortals, which deals with real estate and houses of faith that advocates for the preservation. So this Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative actually offers pre-development grants to houses of faith that qualify. And if you know of one, you can contact me or Google the website. And essentially they're being paid to work with an architect and an attorney primarily, and sometimes an engineer, to see how to best optimize a development that can co-benefit the house of faith, which is sometimes integrated. So housing plus house of faith, actually a very nice combination. But let's open it up to some other questions. Right there. Come on, John.
Come up with something.
I guess following along that line of a church as being a center of community and what holds people together in a community, what do you think is supplanted churches, or is the fact that there is nothing that brings the community together like a church or a synagogue or other religious place?
Netflix.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, I'll share a little bit about my own background and a couple of the projects that AOB is supporting right now. The places and spaces of faith are physical manifestations of shared ideals, right? And shared beliefs. And as a kid of immigrants, I came to this country at a time and a place where my people didn't have those spaces and places. And so actually when I actually worshiped in the basement of a church that offered that space to us for free on a day that they weren't utilizing it, on important days for our community, right? And so places and spaces of worship are often places and spaces of mutuality, of solidarity and allyship in really, really interesting ways. But there's also an opportunity to think about, and I think Jeannie, you were talking about this, the idea of people, right? And one of the projects that IOB is partnering with is with a community in Northwest Arkansas. There's a very strong South Asian community there. They don't necessarily have a space or place in which they're able to congregate, but they have an idea and shared values and shared culture. And so they're able to utilize spaces and places, existing spaces and places in community, and fundraise on our platform to be able to share their culture, share their community, share their ideals with their neighbors who may not have ever been in community or place or space with folks that look like them. So, I think when we think about place and space, and it's odd to say this amongst architects, I know that there's defined uses, right? But then how people engage and interact with it is so much bigger and broader, and kind of beyond our wildest dreams. But the opportunity to allow for that is what's important, and to make the space and the tools and the pathway is what's important.
So do you feel like once, sorry, like I think about this a lot, like I think about architecture and agency, right? And so I think, and when we're talking about building community and when we're talking about making people feel connections, do you feel like once there is a place that community feels kind of even more grounded? Yeah, right. And so
Yeah.
yeah, okay, sorry,
Yeah.
so sorry, because I've been just thinking about this a lot, right? As churches are attended less, as like religious institutions are being attended less and less, the social isolation has increased. But then what will take that place if people aren't going to churches, right? Like, what are the other community uses that we can use in
Yeah.
those places that would rebuild that kind of social connection? That didn't necessarily have to have a religious bent. Like I like there's a church in Greenpoint, the Park Church, that's being sold to developers, because it's falling apart, and the diocese sold it because they don't have any money. And there's been a real movement to make it a community center, so at least people had a place to go and engage, because that connection is so important for building community.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid of Bengali, my father's Bengali, my mom's Gujarati, right? So my dad's Hindu, my mom is Jain, my uncle is Muslim, right? And we are one family, right? My brother married a Christian, like we're all in it, right? And when I graduated from college, I moved to rural Bengal. So this is the eastern part of India, right? The history of India is that British forces, British people decided to sort the community based on religion. And this was like in 2004, 2005, right? So this was not that long ago. Maybe it was long ago, I don't know.
Depends on who you ask.
Yeah, depends on who you ask. The culture of being Bengali continues to supersede religion. And so when I was working with fellow Bengalis in rural India, there was always this idea that you were Bengali first, and then you were Hindu or Muslim after, right? Because that cultural connection was what was so important. And there happened to be a border that was decided by someone who only spent a year in India to say, this side is where Muslims live, and this side is where Hindus live. But the people understood that we were connected, right? And the people understood that solidarity of it, right? So, so much of what we try and do at IOB is to support folks who want to assert themselves spatially, right? So when you were talking, I was thinking about, I think it's in Cleveland, Ohio. We have 5,000 different projects across the country. So I'm always thinking about different projects and thinking about different examples. But there's one example in Cleveland, Ohio, where there's a group of Pakistani folks who fundraised on our platform to create a garden and a park that highlighted Pakistani history. It was very, very similar to the work that you're doing around thinking about prominent women in New York City. And part of what they talk about is the fact that we are here, we matter, and we are a part of this place and space, right? It is not a mosque, right? It is a park, and there is pieces of Pakistani culture that are important to know and understand, independent of and maybe complementary of religion, right? And so there is definitely a space and a place to talk about kind of houses of worship and things like that. But there's also this piece of culture and how we get to build culture together, right?
Anyone else?
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Parks everywhere in the United States. Partly because of the way the urban environment developed, and streets weren't always on grids, and there was always leftover spaces. And not that I'm widely traveled, but certainly from what I've seen in Europe and other countries, it's just natural space for people to congregate, oftentimes private outdoor spaces, very limited. And it really holds the community together, but it seems like, and this is just my supposition, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. But there's a resistance potentially to creating parks, particularly parks with covered spaces where people can communicate, congregate, and because potentially, you get large groups of people that are difficult to control or some other sort of what it might be viewed as negative social impact. Do you sense that there's a resistance to using parks to hold communities together?
I want to answer that.
Parks and plazas.
Parks or plazas. I've worked for most of my life on parks. I'm actually a founding member of the Friends of Hudson River Park, 5 Mile Long Park. And one of the things that, you will all agree on is that parks are actually places of where consensus has to be built, because there may be one group that wants active or for kids and the other group wants passive and quiet, right? And you may want covered space in the wintertime and other people are saying like, oh, no, that's going to attract this or that, and so forth. So I would say, and I'm not sure if you agree, that, it's really the most successful parks are the ones that are able to actually come to a graceful and artful, I wouldn't say the word compromise because that sounds negative, but some kind of an arrangement, a spatial and cultural and programmatic arrangement over time as well, because some spaces in the best parks that I've seen are in fact used differently in the morning than in the evening at night. So park design and public space design, can really vary over the time, and I think they are, for that very reason, sort of like looked toward as something that people have somehow contested and engaged with in some fashion over the years that they have been used. I want to let you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, as the person that runs IOB and looks at our projects every single day, like we have project proposals that come in and I have an alert on my phone. So I'll get project alerts literally all day, every day. So many of them actually are figuring out how to build pop-up parks, pop-up plazas, right? Like, so what that tells me is that there is not enough, and if there is enough, it is not in the right place, right? And so I guess the question I have to you is, who is saying that this is actually not what we should be building? Because from where I sit, people keep on talking about and are working as hard as they can to build them, right? With $50, $100, like I think our average project is usually like $100 that they fundraise, right? It's usually not a lot, but they're like, I'm actually going to take my effort to work on developing a space and a place in which we can congregate and which we can be in community. But I think as you were chatting, I was thinking about my colleagues in Boston, the Design Studio for Social Innovation, and they came out with a really wonderful book that was built on the last 20 years of their work, which is literally called Ideas, Arrangements, and Effects. And their proposal is the fact that ideas actually have arrangements which in turn produce effects, right? So it's very, very simple, right? But when you think about COVID, right, we were thinking about the most basic needs that we needed in the city. And what happened? People thought about community fridges. How do we feed each other? And then people were thinking about how to safely use streets and public ways, right? So how can we be in space and place together, and how can we nourish ourselves physically and spiritually? So I would push back on that, right? And I think the piece is who's saying that, right? Who gets to decide what the arrangements are, or what's allowed and not allowed? And then you should talk to IOB leaders who literally all day, every day are like, don't care, we're going to do this for the day. Don't care, we're going to do this for the month. Don't care, we're going to do this all summer, right? And that's how summer streets happened in New York City, right? There were people who said we were going to do this illegally for a short amount of time, and then it was government and policy that caught up, right? And we see that over and over again in cities across this country, that it's community members that say, you've got this wrong, and we're going to show you something different. And then it's government and policies that say, you know what, actually, you're right. Let's figure out how we can actually operationalize that, right?
Question?
Thanks so much for the presentation.
Uh, so my question is, what I've been observing, community-based or community-led designs, even the language is beginning to change. So the hot word used to be placemaking, and we've now considered a different term, right, which now we call placekeeping, which I think are two fundamentally different terms, but there is a little bit of an overlap, right? So there is some aspect of keeping the integrity of whatever the place, which is different from space, because place is space plus culture plus people, all of these things above. And in some ways, I do think that as design professionals, we've been so focused on making that we forgot about how to keep certain things in place. But I do see that there needs to be some making that still needs to be happening, right? So I'm sure in your line of work, you're constantly struggling. What is the fine line and making and finding opportunities where those things can be. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll take it. I think keeping and making, as you suggest, absolutely go hand in hand. And I also work a lot in decarbonization. I run a little decarbonization research group at Pratt. And so, as you all know, as architects, the most sustainable building is the one that is actually preserved, right? So the keeping and the making and the idea of actually having buildings that are kept and augmented and so forth is really the new way of doing architecture. And I tell that to young students that come into the architecture school, that sometimes think of the shiny new building that they need to build. And I tell them that they have to sort of rebuild, our 20th century, 19th century world by slowly adapting and so forth. But since we've been talking about social systems and communities and people, I believe the same is true because, what we're seeing are intangible, sometimes intangible or invisible, at least invisible to some people, bonds, customs, languages, and so forth. And what I've learned through, especially the Ravenswood Community Land Trust, and understanding the wishes of the local community, I found that, creating spaces, and this is where we're talking about the building part, that those spaces were really intended to host and nurture some of the intangible things, such as, for example, sports. Like, basketball is very big at the Ravenswood houses. I have learned. It's really, really big. Love basketball. And so that can only come together in a space. You can throw a ball and at a wall, but, real basketball is in a space. So I see them really together.
Sure. I think the exciting part about placekeeping is that it actually requires kind of slowing down and listening a little bit, right? Like taking stock of what is valued and why it is valued and how that impacts the community, user group, people, and understanding that there are many people who value different things, and then kind of wrestling with that problem. The idea of placemaking, which is great, but comes a little from on high, right? Where it's like, we come in and we're like, I've got an idea. All of this should be a park because it's just the perfect park, until you realize, well, no, because there's vendors who set up their carts here on the weekends, or actually that's where the fire trucks park, or whatever it is. So the thing I like about the shift to place keeping, it doesn't mean it can't be augmented. It just means that it's paid attention to before it's kind of messed with. Messed with is a technical term. I learned it in school.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have very much to add to that, other than to say that the difference in language connotes both a slowing down, but also an intentionality and an understanding that we get to learn as professionals, right? And that our teachers are community members, right? So much of what we do in the design profession, whether it's planner, architect, designer, just in general, is that we often are in a place or space that's a specific site, right? And the way in which we interact with community, with individuals, with folks in that space and place is a call and response, right? It is this is the site. What are your thoughts on this site, right? This is our code. What can you do within that? And thinking about placekeeping opens up alternative realities in which you can start thinking about what are your hopes and dreams for the neighborhood? And then how do we manifest that spatially? That is a very different conversation than saying that we've just gotten this site and would you like, I don't know, a red wall or a blue, right? We've just gotten this site. How many bathrooms would you like, right? And in our professions, that has been engagement, right? That is how we talk about engagement. But that is not a mutuality. That is not a conversation. That is a call and response. So the idea of placekeeping acknowledges that there is community, culture, space, and place already. And we as practitioners of a field, right? Because they are practitioners of their neighborhood, we get to learn from them and then say, how do we utilize what tools we have, knowing that they're incomplete and knowing that they are non-exhaustive. We get to be in contribution to that rather than the other way around.
I mean,
So we have time for just one more question. Front row. Sorry, Jane, you want
Hi, Corey, how are you?
I'm getting a little apocalyptic here, but I think
Way to end it.
thinking a lot about kind of the current crisis of housing and asylum, community building, and all of the issues we're dealing with globally and regionally, and kind of how zoning and occupancy plays into if we can house, how we can house, what spaces people can inhabit, how, when, why, with sprinklers, without sprinklers. I'm just curious, kind of like what maybe has been the most frustrating aspect of the projects that you guys have been coming up against, and if you see solutions from a policy perspective on how to like really shift that when the next COVID happens or when another migrant wave comes. So hopeful at the end.
Yep.
If anyone wants to take it, just talk shit about this city DOB. I don't know, whatever you want.
Sure, I have lots of ideas. Okay, so you're gonna have to stop me here. Well, when it comes to the asylum seeker crisis, just to be clear, I actually think what is really missing is what we've talked about today, which is a deliberate effort of connecting newcomers to existing families, groups, nonprofits. And I have a very good friend whose family is from Vietnam, who was welcomed into the United States, I believe, 25 years ago. And they had a family that, quote unquote, adopted them, right? I'm familiar with a House of Faith here in New York City, St. Paul and St. Andrews. They adopted a number of asylum seekers and helped them. And I personally feel that that is a program that, should be implemented nationwide, including New York City, to, either with individuals, families, nonprofits, etc. And it should also be funded for people that would do it, but would need financial support or other support. So I personally feel like that kind of network would really significantly not only make a difference directly to the new immigrants. And I do actually have a family member in Europe that actually has done such a thing with Ethiopian immigrants over there. And, you know, it really, really makes a massive difference for both parties. So I think that's one policy change that I'd like to see. Obviously, we need more affordable housing. I have some, you know, and affordable housing, I'm going to plug one of my pet projects here, which is I think the city of New York should better use its own properties. We have 19,000 properties, and many of them are underbuilt. And I actually have a project that I'm cooking up at Pratt with the decarbonization group to actually build on underbuilt city-owned libraries, firehouses, and health facilities that could actually have mass timber housing as additions. Long topic, you can talk about about it with me later, but that is something that I've actually spoken to the mayor about and that they're very interested in. So,
Thanks.
yes.
I want to talk about that more,
Yeah.
actually. But I mean, I was thinking about this actually the other day. I was out at Randall's Island, and there's a migrant sort of tent city that's, I mean, temporary housing out there, but it feels so temporary, and it feels like such a rough place to land, right? Like if you are trying to sort of get your feet on the ground and trying to establish yourself, it feels kind of it feels terrible, right? That's the best word we can come up with. And I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of, you know, agency and humanity, and feeling like how do you make somebody feel respected? Like how do you make them feel like they have a chance? And this can happen in the education sector. It can happen, you know, women who've suffered abuse. It can happen with migrants. It can happen on so many levels. And it can happen in low-income housing. But like, how do you give each individual person respect and agency? And to your point about underbuilt properties and underused office buildings, it feels like there's a real potential there to have people land in a place that's significant and established and in a community in some way, so they can start making connections outside of like an unhoused temporary group who don't know where they're going. And that's the only way you can sort of start establishing yourself in a new place, in a new country, right? Like not always to be shuttled to the side. I don't have a solution for this, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think that's a real conversation we should be having.
I mean, I don't know if I have much to add around that. I will share, you know, less about the story of my family coming to this country, but, you know, as a result of partition and forced displacement, you know, my father was a refugee from Bangladesh into India, and he talks about what it was like for him at the age of 4, riots in his village and not understanding what was happening, and that it was a neighbor, him being Hindu, a Muslim neighbor that housed him in their basement to protect him as a child, right? Wow. Because he was a child. That connection to children and humanity is something that I think we've lost. And he talks about how one of his first memories was that, and then his next memory was getting on, like, I don't know what they're called now, but he calls it a two propeller plane from what is now Bangladesh to what is now India, and settled in what was then Calcutta and is now Kolkata. He was housed by a family that he didn't know. He did not actually go to school until 6th grade. At some point, his little sister was able to make the journey, and he and his little sister would function, would survive on the streets during the day. And it was the humanity of people, of vendors who would give them food, right? Of neighbors who would sit with him so that he could learn how to read, right? Of folks who would make sure that he was safe and protected, even though he did not know where his mother and father were, right? And and so I tell that story, and then you probably think about, as architects and designers, what were the regulations, right? Like, who said that he could not go to school? Was that vendor vending legally and giving food away? Like, he was giving food that he couldn't sell, right? So it was spoiled fruits, give to my dad and my aunt, and my dad would cut out the spoiled bits, he would eat them himself, and then he would give the good bits to his sister, right? Like in the US, you can't sell spoiled fruit. There's regulation on regulation on regulation, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have regulation. I think it is thinking about humanity and people and children above all else, right? And like, I don't have an answer for that. All I can tell is like share my own experiences and like think about if Kolkata at that time were heavily regulated, I don't know what would have happened to my dad, right? He definitely would not have gone to school. He definitely would not have made his way to medical school. He definitely would not have gotten his medical degree. He definitely would not have been able to come to this country, raise 2 children, one of which has too many degrees, right? But it was the humanity of people, right? And it was the ability to move beyond whatever little regulations, a newly formed India had to be able to take care of each other. So.
Speaking of which, congratulations for your next degree.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a month.
In a month. I hope you have a big graduation party.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so very much. I just want to very quickly say that the next meeting that we have is next month, April 17th. It's a collaboration with our co-chair on the co-committee, Michelle Todd, who's here in the back, and it's on materials. So it's at FX Collaborative. I want to thank you guys for such a fantastic presentation, sharing stories, all of which kind of represent what we're talking about, things that you planned for, structure, regulation, conversations that went all over in the most wonderful way. Thank you. Great to meet you again. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Can I have a second? Thank you, and please consider the remains part of all of our collective community responsibility to remove from the site one way or another. Thank you, David.
Exactly.
Thank you, everybody.
I think the cookie is excellent. This is so interesting. This is so interesting. It was very cool. Yes, it was really fun. It was great to meet you in person too.